In the liberal West today, both the right and the left have accepted the paradigm that individualism is the highest possible good, with the mutual enemy of fascism being the worst possible evil. Academic Agent has poignantly described this phenomenon as the boomer truth regime. How we think of ourselves under liberalism is really an illusion, and a dangerous one. The illusion of the self, the illusion of individualism, or liberalism, is a tricky one because on its face it does appear that people can live seemingly fine, independent lives apart from their community, doing as they please. But it's harder to see the larger harmful effect that it has on society long term. You see this yearning in liberals to go back to a 1990s era liberalism where this sort of attitude was starting to become fully realized and seemingly had no consequence. It's kind of like someone pounding drinks and having a good time and haven't yet thought of what they'll feel like at 7 a.m. the next morning. Liberals and binge drinkers alike fail to realize that everything they love inevitably leads to everything they hate. The individual does exist in the context of a community. That is an inescapable reality, however close-knit or stratified that community happens to be. Our society has developed into the hellhole it currently is precisely because we have hyper-individualism. Part of the horror of fascism is its position opposite to that of human rights, of which are part of an ever-growing list. It's also opposite to just liberal notions of freedom in general. Under liberalism, the individual is the most important thing, and ideas like civil rights, human rights, free speech, freedom from, and freedom to, all are the rocks of Gibraltar that liberalism holds near and dear. Conversely, the horror of liberalism is in the fact that things like human rights, civil rights, free speech, and all the freedoms that liberalism guarantees can only exist in a moral, sane, and patriotic or nationalistic population. Once those prerequisites disappear, which is guaranteed to happen under liberalism itself, liberalism inevitably becomes a petri dish for the deadly virus of hyper-individualism, and that metastasizes into stage 4 civilizational collapse. I have thought long and hard about how exactly you work within the current system of hyper-liberalism to realize any form of real change. But since liberalism has bred such a vast array of diametrically opposed worldviews and can't even believe in a common shared reality, certain tactics are out of the question. You're not going to be able to take these people to church and have them see the light and snap out of it. You can't play a Tucker Carlson clip and have them change their position. And they control too many institutions of power to fight back in any grassroots populist way. Here's the absurdity of liberalism all wrapped up in one analogy. All across America, an increasingly alarming amount of homeless bums have made city centers into unlivable apocalyptic hellscapes. We apparently can do nothing as these people take huge steamy dumps in the street, commit serious crime, and then go on to OD on fentanyl in the middle of the street in broad daylight, and will simply be replaced by yet another crazy person. You might ask yourself, well, why can't we have these people rounded up and taken care of? Don't we owe it to the tax-paying portion of society to keep our streets safe for ourselves and our kids? Homeless people have these insidious things called human and civil rights that protect them from effective action being taken. In the aftermath of this decision to leave these people alone, or better yet, subsidize their drug habits like Biden is doing, people become desensitized to these conditions over time. Seeing druggies shoot up on the street becomes just another aspect of liberalism that you learn to tolerate, along with the pride flag flying overhead, or BLM flags waving, as you walk through a crude, graffiti-ridden simulacrum of what your city used to be 100 years ago, when this country was much less liberal. You'll hear excuses like, oh, homeless people are harmless, just leave them alone and they'll leave you alone. But that's just not true, and the stats on crime bear that out. But liberalism requires that we lie to ourselves and others about how bad the problem is to avoid the uncomfortable reality of what we'd have to do to actually fix the problem. And as usual, the solutions are fascist ones. Or at least that's what they're labeled as, because our liberal society has disintegrated into such pure retardation that we associate any rules at all as being fascist. Here's another analogy. Let's say you like spending money. and you are an out-of-control spender, and after several years of this self-destructive behavior, you've ended up with a massive amount of debt. Multiple maxed-out credit cards, a car that's way too much for what you make, a house payment that's crippling you, student debt, the list goes on and on. Then you stumble upon a Dave Ramsey video, and he provides a solution in a realistic way out of debt. But what you have to do feels yucky. You have to start to spend less and save more, sometimes needing to earn more as well. But most importantly, you have to learn to love saving more than you love spending if you ever want to get to a healthy place with your long-term finances. It takes a monumental paradigm shift to enact actual change. But what if that change was labeled as fascist? How much would that hinder your progress? Well, that's exactly where we are with society now. Think of human rights and civil rights as the legal equivalent of, I can afford it, when clearly we can't. Look at where this moral frivolity has landed us. It's an improper attitude that gives cover to the worst behavior that will lead to collapse. And if you have that mindset, then budgets are fascist, rules are fascist, personal responsibility is fascist. The freakout over the overturning of Roe v. Wade showed us that. These people hate personal responsibility just like the shopping addict doesn't like to hear, you can't afford that. After all, it's a shopper's right to choose, they'd say. And there's that dirty word again, right. So what's the root cause of this problem? Jonathan Bowden describes liberalism as indifference. What do you care what I do with my body or how I spend my money? If it's not hurting you, then why concern yourself with it? Because societies and communities are only as good as the individuals in them. And if you're hurting yourself, then you hurt society at large. It's this inability to literally think one step further that is the major flaw of liberalism. You are never just yourself in a vacuum, but rather an important link in a society that needs you to be the best you can be in the role you were meant to play. The problem with liberalism is it has a perspective on the individual and the self that isn't accurate. To be a part of a community is not to be a meaningless cog in the machine. This idea of being the special, unique butterfly that moves out of her small hometown to find stardom is not inspirational. In reality, it's why her hometown sucks in the first place. People talk of how LA is full of transplants because everyone is there to work in the industry, and as such, there's no connection to LA itself. It's simply a tool they're using to find stardom. And so LA is a trash heap. It's a bus stop on the way to somewhere better. It's a city where everyone is trying to do their own thing, which in turn makes it one of the most inhospitable places in the US. Same with New York City too. This has spread society-wide. All across America, there is a deep distrust in your fellow American. I think the proliferation of true crime shows has only increased that. We instinctively don't trust people who aren't one of us. And there's 100,000 things you could be. So just strolling through the airport, you might encounter the barefoot runner who's min-maxing their performance for the next event they have. Then you pass a Boy Scout leader. Then you pass a blue-haired who knows what. Then you pass a nerdy teen edgelord who's into God knows what kind of weird Japanese porn. And then you pass by an 80-year-old crocheting to pass the time by. And don't get me started on how many people are existing in a heavily medicated state 24/7. As a result, nobody trusts anyone because we've been trained to only associate with people in our groups. That's the tangible level of hyper-individualism. The higher, more meta-political aspect is that now we lack the common threads that unite a nation, and in fact are being pulled away from each other in as many directions as there are people. The common criticism is that the two-party system is broken because it doesn't represent anyone anymore. But how can it under hyper-individualism? Think of an engine with all of its parts. It has to be arranged properly and in order for it to actually run. But if you move all the parts around and the spark plugs get to hang out with the oil filter and you let the valves pretend that they're the fuel injectors, nothing will run right. Everything has to be orientated in a certain way around the all-important crankshaft. Once you dispose of that kind of a system, it falls apart real quick. And that's where we're at now. Hyper-individualistic pieces of society floating around, completely incapable of organizing in the way we were designed to operate best. When I think of the 4th of July, we're celebrating a time when things were allowed to work, and pieces of the engine weren't allowed to just walk off and assume other roles. And yet, in our hubris, we think we have figured it out in this liberal society. In our minds, we are speeding down the Autobahn faster and more elegantly than anyone has ever done it in the best, most diverse car ever created. We're white-knuckling the steering wheel in awe of the modern machine that we've created, while the wind whips around us in the cabin. When the truth is, we're sitting in a broken-down piece of crap that once was a supercar, but one that we destroyed and vandalized ourselves and can only pretend that it moves forward if we close our eyes and forget that we destroyed the engine and threw the various parts across the yard as the wind gently blows by us. Anyways, that's all the time I have for today. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving this video a like or maybe subscribing. I will see you all in the next video. Peace.